All right, guys, welcome back. Another episode in the series on the genuine pros and cons of certain dietary protocols, the dietary hot takes, your daily dose. So today we are looking at intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. Roughly the same thing. Well, let's look. So our definitions here of the two. So by definition, intermittent fasting, it's a nice long-winded definition here. The mindful and active decision to fast for prolonged periods throughout the day. Time-restricted eating is technically a variant or offspring of intermittent fasting. Most of your followers of intermittent fasting are going to choose to fast anywhere from 6 to 12 hours throughout the day, with more extreme approaches promoting day-long or multiple day-long fasts. And we'll see that in kind of some of the research that we look at. We're going to look at a seminal study that that examined alternate day fasting, ADF as they call it, where we actually don't eat for an entire 24-hour window. You'll see people that fast for weeks. I'm pretty sure the world record for a fast is somewhere north of 300 days. So fasting can take many extreme forms. Intermittent is usually 6 to 12 hours throughout the day. You're just not eating in that window. Time-restricted eating allows for more of a varied approach. There's a variety of different strategies that you'll see here. And again, it's just a mindful and active decision to consume all of your caloric needs for the day within a restricted time frame. So where intermittent fasting focuses on the fasting window, time-restricted eating focuses more on the eating window. So people usually do like a 6 to 10 hour period. Most of the research is looking at an 8-hour eating window. The majority of your followers are going to choose to fast in the early part of the day, usually up to around 10 to 11 a.m., and then they cut off their eating anywhere from like 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The amount of time that they're fasting or the eating window will change based on the individual. Some individuals like to get it all in 2 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, a lot of ways to skin this cat. So we're going to focus on both strategies and the use for optimizing body composition, which means maximizing our fat loss and muscle gain simultaneously. Now, starting off with a shameless plug, Gifted Performance has already done an interview with Matthew Stratton from Kennesaw State, who has done the bulk of his research into intermittent fasting. If you just search Gifted Performance intermittent fasting on YouTube, you'll find it. I put the link below. We'll also include the link in the bio so you can watch that. So this will kind of be an amended, a shortened version of what we talked about there, because Matt did a really good job of discussing the details of intermittent fasting and what the research says. So the first study that we're going to look at, and I like to start these presentations off with, what is the normal way to lose body fat in this scenario, which would be just daily caloric restriction, and then what is the proposed alternate method of accomplishing the same goal. So this study looked at alternate day fasting, that ADF that I was talking about, versus daily caloric restriction. So because ADF is a variant of time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting, we can lump it in and now we can compare it to daily caloric restriction. So the name of the study was a randomized pilot study comparing 0-calorie alternate day fasting to daily caloric restriction in adults with obesity. Took 26 adults. They were aged 18 to 55, BMI greater than 30. So anything over 30 for BMI is going to be classified as obese. So everyone in the study was obese, and a wide variety of ages here. Now they were randomized into two groups. 0-calorie alternate day fasting and a 400 kilocalorie daily deficit group. So a little bit more about each group here. In the alternate day fasting group, day one of their diet, they had absolutely 0 calories. This was water, bouillon cubes, and 0-calorie beverages, as well as some extra electrolyte supplements as well, but 0 calories. They were ingesting no calories throughout the day. Day two, they were provided with a diet. So they were provided with a specific diet that they were supposed to eat. And then they were given ad libitum, meaning you can have as much as you want, intake of 5 to 7 200-calorie snacks per day. So if you wanted to have those extra snacks throughout the day on your eating days, you could, but you didn't have to. Now, the calorie restriction group, they were provided with a diet that created a 400 kcal deficit daily. So they took the individuals, they estimated what their total daily energy expenditure was, they lopped off 400, and they said, all right, eat this every single day. So if we look at comparing the two groups, the calorie restriction group had a lot more controlled diet. They had something that they had to eat every single day, whereas the alternate day fasting group, they had their fasting days, and then they had their day 2, where they had their meal plan, and they could essentially eat whatever they wanted, or they could eat as many of those snacks as they wanted. So the results, some people will say, oh, fasting for an entire day, it's not safe. So there was no adverse effects in the ADF group. I did a lot of research, or I looked into a lot of the research on fasting, found almost no adverse effects outside of individuals who were trying to fast with pre-existing conditions. So no changes in weight loss at 8 weeks. So when we compare the two groups, they both completed their 8-week diet. They both lost the same amount of weight. No statistically significant differences between the groups when it came to weight loss. The ADF group, so it was a self-reported dietary intake, and the ADF group reported that they were consuming 376 kilocalories less than the caloric restriction group on average. So you might say, well, why was there no difference in their weight loss if they were eating significantly less calories per day? I suspect that it was like with any self-reporting food study, they weren't reporting how many of those ad libitum 200 calorie snacks they were actually eating. They followed up with the individuals at 24 weeks. No significant differences in weight regain. For some reason, the alternate day fasting group showed favorable changes in baseline fat mass, meaning that despite the fact that both groups had no significant difference in weight regain, it looked like the alternate day fasting group had a favorable retention of lean mass, and they weren't gaining back as much fat mass. Not sure exactly why that was. Conclusion from the authors was that the alternate day fasting is a safe alternative to caloric restriction. However, there are no additional benefits when it comes to losing weight or maintaining that weight post-diet. So let's look at kind of another study. This would be a review, and we were looking at intermittent fasting. So in this review, they took studies that included alternate day fasting, time-restricted eating, 8-hour windows, 6-hour windows, intermittent fasting. They wanted to look at the totality of the research on intermittent fasting and how it compares to daily caloric restriction. Now, because this was such a long, winded write-up, it was a very, very comprehensive review of the literature. I just included some important bullet points from the authors. So first one being that recent findings suggest that intermittent fasting and alternate day fasting are equally as effective as caloric restriction. No surprise there. If we control the calories, we should see similar weight loss, whether we're using an intermittent fasting approach or a caloric restriction approach. Next point that the authors made was that it's unclear whether IF and ADF have additive effects over caloric restriction when it comes to treatment of chronic diseases like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. That's another one that people kind of struggle with, and they say, all right, well, these intermittent fasting approaches, they offer benefits when it comes to glucose control, when it comes to cellular turnover, when it comes to increasing growth hormone, decreasing insulin resistance, decreasing lipids, all the things that people promote on social media or on these evidence-based blogs when they are proponents of intermittent fasting. But when we look at caloric restriction versus intermittent fasting, both groups lose the same amount of weight. We see similar improvements in other health markers as well. So there seems to be no additive benefit there. And then they kind of summed up the results of the analysis of the literature. There were superior decreases in body weight when it came to caloric restriction versus ADF or IF. So when we look at the totality of the literature, caloric restriction outperforms intermittent fasting. And that's probably due to the fact that there's not as much research on intermittent fasting. In the controlled trials where we match the groups, pretty much the exact same results. Comparable reductions in visceral fat, so visceral fat being the fat that surrounds the organs, that's associated with metabolic disorder, so comparable reductions there, as well as fasting insulin and insulin resistance, so lose the body weight, all those markers improve. None of the interventions provided significant glucose reductions without weight loss, so that's also an important one. So let's say someone goes on an intermittent fasting, or even a caloric restriction. Intermittent fasting, caloric restriction, doesn't really matter. If there's no reduction in body weight, there's going to be no reduction in those health markers, no improvement in those health markers. So these approaches, intermittent fasting, alternate day fasting, they do offer promise for individuals. However, they don't offer any additional benefit that we've seen in the literature thus far. So my takeaway from this study, my hot take, is that you want to pick the one that you like and can stick to better. If you're a big fan of alternate day fasting and it helps you reduce your caloric intake and helps you lose body weight and keep it off, then cool, stick with that. But if you're more of in line with the just gradual caloric restriction over time consistently, then go with that. Just stick with the one that works better for you and your lifestyle. All right, now getting into my pros and cons of intermittent fasting. Like always, we will start with the pros. I think the biggest pro for intermittent fasting, and it's one of the reasons why I actually use it, sort of, is that it's very schedule friendly for most. So if you think about the schedule of an average American, what do? We wake up, we grab our coffee, we go to work, we get to work, we're immediately bogged down with stuff to do, we forget to eat or just don't really have much of an appetite, and then 11 or 12 or whatever it is rolls around, it's lunch break, and it's time to actually eat. So that's kind of pseudo intermittent fasting. It's not like a conscious effort to do it. It just kind of happens on a day-to-day basis. So the old adage that breakfast is the most important meal of the day has kind of lost its luster in recent years as intermittent fasting has gotten more popular. And then some of the more recent literature looking into people who skip breakfast. People love to quote this one. I forget who the authors were on it, but there was a study that showed that on average, people who skip breakfast have a higher BMI. But what they didn't control for was the fact that people were overeating later in the day. When we control for calories, so let's say you eat 2,000 calories, you skip breakfast, or you don't skip breakfast, the results will be the same. So as long as you're not overcompensating. So breakfast, the most important meal of the day? Probably not. So skipping breakfast can actually be conducive, especially if you're not hungry in those early hours of the day. Don't feel like you have to stop off at Starbucks and get your egg bites or whatever it may be. You don't necessarily need those calories early in the day, unless you train early in the day or that's your schedule and you manage your 24 hour. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the 24-hour calorie intake is the biggest determinant of your weight loss or weight gain. Now, there are some caveats in this one. Individual preference. Some people like breakfast. Some people like to sit down with their family and have breakfast, grab the sausage McMuffin, whatever it is. And if you control the rest of the day, then you're good to go. It is not ideal for regular breakfast eaters. So one thing that people kind of struggle with as they transition over to this approach is that if you're used to eating breakfast and you skip it, you will likely be hungrier as you adapt to this by the time you get to lunch. And then it's not uncommon to overcompensate and overeat at lunch. So you want to try to avoid that. So just don't overeat the rest of the day. If you find that skipping breakfast causes you to overeat the rest of the day, maybe this isn't the right strategy for you. Is there an effect on metabolism? You will also hear people say that if you skip breakfast, it slows your metabolism throughout the day. There's no physiological mechanism or research to support that point whatsoever. The next pro of intermittent fasting. Now, there are temporary, and this is a very important key word because people love to throw these around as positives of intermittent fasting, and they are positives, but they are temporary, and we're not 100% sure yet that they offer any chronic benefit, but they're still important to mention. So there are temporary acute hormonal and cellular changes. People always point to this. They say, when I'm fasting, what happens? My growth hormone goes way up. True. Insulin goes way down. True. Cellular turnover goes up. Yay! All of those things are true. But when we get into the eating window, what happens? Well, all those changes are offset. Insulin goes up because you've just eaten. Growth hormone then drops off, and cellular turnover slows. So what's the net gain there? It's sped up just to slow down, even throughout the day. Probably. But this could still be an interesting area of further research looking into, do these growth hormone elevations, insulin reductions, do they actually have long-term benefits if someone intermittent fasts for a year, 2 years, a decade, whatever it may be. Third positive that people like to point to is the increased lifespan. Intermittent fasting will increase your lifespan by 10 years. Anyone ever seen that headline? It's a headline that I saw. It got very popular. People were sharing it. The problem with the headline was that it was a study that was done in earthworms that was extrapolated out to humans. I'm not an earthworm. You're not an earthworm. So that's not exactly the most practical research to apply to you. So only animal models so far. And it looks like in those same animal models that caloric restriction just in general tends to improve lifespan or increase lifespan. So before we say intermittent fasting will make you live longer, let's be patient. A couple more pros here. I like this graphic that we've got over here on the left. It kind of shows some of the mechanisms of animal research in terms of the effect that intermittent fasting has. So we have an obese mouse at the top. Feed them as much as they want. They become morbidly obese. You put them on a time-restricted schedule where they can only eat at certain times. Yes, they still are obese, but they become more fit, more physically fit and healthy. Lean mice, give them ad libitum intake of whatever they want. They become fat. Restrict that. They don't. Start with lean mice again. Give them a time-restricted eating. They stay lean and fit. So this was kind of the animal model that they wanted to apply to humans, and we haven't seen it yet in practice quite yet in humans. So some more pros outside of the cool mouse picture. It is an effective calorie restriction protocol, and it works in a few ways. So I like how it works in a couple ways. It's multifactorial. So the first way that it can work is that it limits your food intake to windows where you are less likely to overconsume. So it works with your willpower. So if you say at 9 p.m. every night, I stand in front of the pantry and I just really want to go ham on some Oreos. By implementing a time-restricted eating pattern and saying, listen, all my food is done by 8 p.m., I am not allowed to eat outside that window, you've all of a sudden taken away that 9 p.m. temptation right there. Oh, well, it's outside of my eating window. I can't eat, so therefore I won't. Can also limit food intake to a shorter window to prevent or to limit ad libitum intake. So to limit that snacking. If I know that I can only eat from, let's say, noon to 6 p.m. every day, and I'm usually a big snacker in the morning. I show up at work, there's bagels. Oh, hell yeah, I got to get some bagels. Karen has some of those chocolate-covered pretzels at her desk. Yeah, I'm going to grab some of those as well. Nope, can't happen. I start at lunch. That's when I start my eating at 12. Start eating at my lunch, get my big lunch. I'm nice and full. And then 6 p.m. rolls around, and that's outside of my eating window. So now I can't, grab the chicken nuggets off my son's plate when he's eating, or, grab a bite of ice cream from my wife, or whatever it may be. Again, it's just working with your willpower to remove that impetus to snack throughout the day. So 2 good strategies there. It will, if you lose weight, also decrease all-cause mortality. So this is shown in the research over and over again, is that when you lose body fat, when you lose weight down to a healthy body weight, we see an improvement in all of your metabolic markers. Your lipids go down, your insulin improves, your blood glucose goes down, your fat mass and your body percentage goes down, and all of a sudden we are just adding years back to your life. You are decreasing your risk of dying early. So if intermittent fasting accomplishes that, that's all good in the hood. So I wanted to include one other quote here from Patterson et al., his review of the effects of IF, of intermittent fasting. Said that this overview suggests that intermittent fasting regimens may be a promising approach to losing weight and improving metabolic health for people who can safely tolerate intervals of not eating. So that's an important one. Some people just don't like not eating, or eating very little for certain hours of the day, night, or days of the week. Proven to be efficacious, these eating regimens may offer promising non-pharmacological approaches to improving health at the population level with multiple public health benefits. So it looks like, hey, if this is a good way for you to reduce your calories and you reduce your body weight, then this is going to be something that is beneficial for your health in the long run. However, intermittent fasting isn't all just pros. There are definitely some cons here. And again, So I said it in the IFYM presentation, I said it in the keto presentation, I'm gonna say it again here as well. Education is extremely important. You can't just dive right into this without any knowledge, or maybe you saw some ad on Pinterest about intermittent fasting and you're just gonna jump right into it. There is an overly simplistic view out there, and that view will get you in trouble. And the overly simplistic view of intermittent fasting is that if you eat all of your food in this specific window, you will not gain fat, you will lose weight, your health will improve. And just the same thing with IFYM, with keto, your health will not improve unless you control for a couple things. So you still need to be mindful of your calories, of your protein, of your fiber, and your micronutrients. So you still need to be mindful of food quality and quantity over everything, and then use those eating windows in your favor. The second con would be that some individuals have a certain preference on meal size. You get one camp of people that likes the small meals more frequently, and then you get one camp of people that likes the larger meals with less frequency. So those who like the smaller meals with greater frequency probably aren't going to enjoy the intermittent fasting or like the intermittent fasting approach very much. Now, there are some important strategies here to consider with dieting versus massing. So it looks like with dieting, there's greater adherence when individuals can eat larger meals. People, when you're dieting, you're pretty much hungry all day. So you do want to get a larger meal because that will fill the stomach more and provide a greater sense of satiety. So eating those very small, frequent meals when you're dieting probably doesn't do much for your hunger levels, and intermittent fasting can be a better approach. On the opposite side of that, when you're massing, when you're trying to gain weight and you're trying to eat as much as possible or fit a lot of food in, it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and fit 5,000, 6,000, whatever the calories are in a 6-hour window, because you're going to have to eat so much in one sitting that it's just going to make you sick. In that scenario, you might want to space it out more. So intermittent fasting may be good for dieting, probably not so much for massing. And we talk about this in the interview with Matt Stratton. One other argument that I have seen is the MPS argument, and you hear this I hear this a lot from bodybuilders. And they say the more frequent feedings, those 5 to 6 feedings of protein per day, outperform 2 to 3 feedings of protein per day because of the fact that you're getting more frequent spikes in MPS. And that's what I kind of added in the graphic right here. And when we look at the research on this, when we look at, all right, what outperforms? Is it 3 feedings a day or is it 6 feedings a day? When we look at hypertrophy, there seems to be no difference between the two. 3 feedings a day or 6 feedings a day, 5, whatever it may be, there's gonna be no difference in hypertrophy over the course of weeks, months, years. And the reason that that exists is because of this right here. So if you guys can, my pointer isn't showing up. I fucked up. All right, but if we look at the top graph, what we can see is that when the graph spikes up, we're looking at muscle protein balance, or muscle protein synthesis, and on the bottom, the fasted losses are muscle protein breakdown, or MPB. With greater size feedings, we get a greater spike. So it's all about area under the curve rather than frequency of spikes. If area under the curve is roughly the same between groups, then we should expect similar muscular hypertrophy in the groups. And if you're really a muscle protein synthesis nerd, buff, you really like that stuff, Coach Hector is going to be putting out a muscle protein synthesis video on the channel, so be on the lookout for that soon. He'll do a much better job of explaining it than me. My interpretation of the current data on the muscle protein synthesis argument is 3 to 6 feedings per day. 5 or 6 does outperform 2, but 3 to 6 feedings of protein per day, spaced 2 to 4 hours apart, seems to be a safe bet. All right, last set of cons here. Timing of food can be an issue. So if you choose to fast in the morning and you train in the morning, you might say, ooh, fasted training, my gains are gonna wither away, I'm gonna be small, I'm not gonna be able to train as hard. And that's very individualized. Some individuals train fasted and they do quite well. Some individuals have to have, or they feel like they have to have that meal before they go and train. So it can prove to be an issue for some, but training fasted is probably more of a psychological issue than it is a physiological issue when we're talking about hypertrophy training. Fact is that hypertrophy training is not maximal. It's not extremely high volume like endurance training where you definitely need to be eating before training. So it's probably a non-issue unless you're going to an extreme level or training on an absolute maximal basis. Then you run into some issues. So maybe in like your 4th or your 5th week of your training program of your mesocycle, when you're really going into some of that overreaching work, then maybe you might want to eat before training or during training. But it's probably a non-issue outside of that scenario. Now, I kind of touched on this with the breakfast in the pros section, but skipping breakfast can cause a compensatory increase in 24-hour calorie intake. And that's what happens when we look at the research that shows this link between increased BMI and skipping breakfast, is that people skip breakfast, they're absolutely ravenous by lunch, and they eat way, way too much. They eat a breakfast, then they have a more reasonable lunch, more reasonable dinner down the line. So there is a habituation process here of getting used to skipping breakfast. The first couple days, weeks that you do this, you are going to be really hungry in the morning. But there are some strategies around that. So you want to use some appetite regulation strategies like drinking coffee, maybe staying busy. The worst thing for a dieter is idle hands. You start grabbing for stuff. Removing yourself from situations with food. So maybe you've got a staff meeting where they always bring donuts or bagels and you want to sit as far away as possible from them. Removing yourself from that situation, or a variety of other strategies that can be very, very successful when it comes to getting yourself used to that skipping breakfast. There are also some early side effects that people report. These aren't reported by everyone, but things like hunger, stress. I threw hangry over there. People say they feel hangry. Headaches, constipation, dehydration. The dehydration one is an interesting one because if you aren't eating in the morning, you should be drinking more, you should be hydrating, so you shouldn't be running into hydration issues. And then, of course, it's going to be contraindicated for some special populations. So if you've got blood sugar issues, if you've got diabetes, please don't intermittent fast. If you're pregnant, don't intermittent fast. Children and adolescents should be eating a balanced, nutritious diet, healthful diet throughout the entire day. If you're looking for peak sport performance, I would suggest not fasting because going into training sessions fasted can impair performance. If you're trying to gain as much muscle as possible, again, you're going to want to spread your food out more over the day because you're going to have to eat more food. And then certain metabolic disorders, just talk with your physician if you think that you may have some condition that is contraindicated for an intermittent fasting approach. All right, drum roll, please. The overall grade on intermittent fasting, what are we going to give it? The highest grade so far, actually. So intermittent fasting earns a B, so slightly higher than keto and a good bit higher than IFYM. So why do I like intermittent fasting so much? I like it a lot because it's very, very schedule friendly. Again, we look at the schedule for the adult professional. Intermittent fasting really matches up with that and can offer a viable strategy for total 24-hour daily caloric intake reduction for management of body weight. It also offers a little bit of that psychological assistance as well. So it can help you limiting your snacking by reducing your eating window, or it can work with your willpower knowing, hey, late at night, that's when I reach for the Ben & Jerry's. You know what? 9 p.m. is when I often find myself binging and blowing my calories out of the water for the day. So therefore, I'm going to not eat after 8 p.m. or whatever it may be. Reduce that strain on your willpower. Remember, willpower is an expendable resource. You can't white knuckle your way through everything. The research seems to show favorable results. So when we look at the research on intermittent fasting and we compare it to caloric restriction, most of the research is right there. It says, yeah, it's good. It's very, very comparable. Similar results. So it's a strategy that can definitely work. Not magic, but can work. Works especially well when calories are restricted. So when you are on a low calorie diet and you want to still feel like you're eating something, some sort of substantive meals of reasonable size, reducing your eating window or reducing the hours or implementing a fasting regimen can still make you feel like, I'm still able to get decent sized meals in despite my low calorie intake. Whereas spreading those meals out, it's like, hooray, I get 2 ounces of chicken and 4 spinach leaves. Yay, my life is so great. So condensing it into a smaller window can sometimes make those meals feel larger and satiate you via the stomach stretch reflex a little better. Now, there are still some cons here. Still have to eat a healthful diet, still have to emphasize the basics, the fruit, the veg, the lean meats, whole grains, essential fatty acids, those kind of things. Definitely not ideal for those who prefer smaller meals. So for those who like to spread their meals throughout the day, intermittent fasting would not be the approach. Or those looking to gain weight who need to be eating a considerable amount of calories throughout the day. Definitely some side effects early on. That hanger can get you. And the research is still young. So we're still looking at very, very young, new research. It's promising, but again, we want to give it time. So where will we be on intermittent fasting in 10 years? Who knows, but we're going to find out. As always, I included my references here. If you want to look at some of these references, feel free to DM me at The Squad Father or at Gifted Performance, and I will send over all of my references to you so you can read through them on your own. That wraps up intermittent fasting. I hope you enjoyed the video. Drop a like, comment, subscribe. If you're a fan of intermittent fasting, tell me what you think about how I did. What kind of grade would you give it? As always, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe or follow us over on Instagram at Gifted Performance. If you like what we are doing, if you support the mission, sign up for our $30 a month automated coaching. Get access to 15 training programs, macronutrient programming, meal planning, a place to track your weight, a place to track your PRs. You can always look back on your training, see how much you've improved. The people over there are really loving it, really getting great results from those training programs. If you want a more personalized approach, feel free to reach out directly to one of our one-on-one coaches or apply to work with them directly. You can see information on our coaches on the Gifted Performance coach page. If you're looking for templates, merchandise, hit the storefront. Let us know what you think. If you got an idea for a shirt, you want this sweater, you want a fanny pack, you want some socks, you want some short shorts, let us know. We will make it happen. That's a wrap. That's all my shameless plugging for the day. That's a wrap. I'm going to see you on the next one. And as always, stay gifted. All right, Lenny, you can go ahead and cut it.